While the EFF leader, Julius Malema, has slammed the country's vaccine rollout, saying it's nowhere near the goal that had been first set down by government. Malema says the delay will continue to weaken the already struggling economy. The EFF leader further called for the suspension of contact learning as COVID-19 cases continue to rise.
South Africa continues its accelerated path into socio-economic collapse under the leadership of both Ramaphosa and the ANC. At the center of the socio-economic devastation is the COVID-19 pandemic, which is ripping families and livelihoods apart. No other generation has witnessed so much death and sickness than our own. The pandemic is taking breadwinners, shutting down businesses, increasing unemployment and interrupting schooling. The massive death happens with the ANC and Ramaphosa totally unable to lead a sustainable response and roll out of vaccine. As things stand, there is no hope that South Africa will see the rollout of vaccine to reach expected population immunity by end of 2021. Majority of the frontline workers, particularly those who were working under level 5 lockdown like the police, security guard, taxi and bus drivers, petrol attendants, retail workers and cleaners have not been vaccinated. The desperation to only use Western-produced vaccine to the exclusion of Chinese and Russian vaccines has resulted into countless delays of purchases from J&J. Following the announcement of the third wave, under the rising number of infections, we call on immediate closure of contact learning. There is no reason to force contact learning because already there are rising infections amongst young people and children, which are disrupting schools. To ensure a fast move beyond the third waves, schools must be closed.
All right, and of course this call for schools to be closed comes as the Department of Basic Education is readying itself to have full-time learning, at least in the primary level of schools. So it's certainly a story that we'll have to keep watching. Well, South Africa is in a third wave of COVID-19, and the country hasn't vaccinated nearly enough people for its vaccination rollout to make a difference to the potential severity of this wave. Well, let's talk to Bhekisisa Editor-in-Chief Mia Malan. Mia, I began by saying we're in the third wave. That seems to be the consensus of many experts. Do the numbers, at least nationally, finally correspond with that view?
So South Africa has a formula that it uses to determine whether we're in a third wave or not. And that formula says we must have reached at least 30% of the cases of the peak of the previous wave before we can say we've started with a new wave. Now, in 4 provinces, we have reached that 30% mark, and I'm sure you've heard them. It's Gauteng, Northwest, Northern Cape, and Free State. In some of the other provinces, we haven't reached them yet. Nationally, that figure was around about 25% on Monday. It might be a little bit higher now. So nationally, we're not there yet, but we're likely to, according to many experts, to get there in the next week to 10 days.
When we look at the latest numbers coming in today, Mia, we've got 9,149 cases recorded. And of course, the last time we saw numbers like this was in mid-January.
Yes, Kathy, and the concerning thing is that the numbers that you see now are actually the numbers of 2 weeks ago, because tests take a time for the results to be released, and it also takes time for your infection to show up on a test, for you to actually go for a test. So we generally work with a 10 to 14 days backlog. And the concerning thing that we really need to look at is that our positivity rate, so in other words, the proportion of tests that come out positive, is now, for yesterday, it was 16.5%. And the measurement that we can use to measure that is that the World Health Organization says once you've passed a 5% positivity rate, your pandemic is out of control. So we're getting to a serious increase of cases now.
Mia, is it surprising that Gauteng currently is the largest contributor to these cases? And the reason why I put that question in the way that I have is that we've heard from multiple experts again that there was an assumption that the provinces that had been previously experienced a high burden of COVID-19 would probably be less affected this time around.
So the pandemic moves through the country, obviously, and we have the Free State and the Northern Cape where it started the earliest this time around. In fact, if you look at the Northern Cape, it looks like they've reached their peak, and as if the cases are starting to go down now. And so it depends how people travel. I know what you're meaning is that, do we, for instance, have enough natural immunity in Gauteng to protect us against a very bad next wave? Well, obviously it's spreading, so there must be something that's not protecting us. But I'm, of course, not an epidemiologist, so I'm perhaps not the best person to answer that question.
Let's just continue here then in terms of government's own planning, especially where what we're seeing now is the vaccine rollout that has been stalled, especially because Johnson & Johnson vaccines have not yet arrived, Mia. Has that been a great dent to the situation that we're facing today, or was it inevitable that we'd end up here?
Well, I think we don't have control over the J&J vaccines. It is not our fault that there were batches of ingredients that could have been contaminated that ended up in our vaccines. And I think we've had another setback with J&J earlier this year with a relationship to very rare types of blood clots. And I think those two incidents are not... It's really out of our control. What is in our control is how we communicate about this pandemic and how we communicate about the vaccinations when there is such a desperate situation where people are getting anxious because there just aren't enough vaccines. And I think that is something that the health department can improve on. To give you an idea, there's not been a single press release on the J&J vaccines. It's all that you've read in the media, and it's the media that called the health department. I, for instance, had a teacher calling us this morning where they had to sign consent forms in school for the J&J vaccines that might come up in for teachers. And they wanted to know, should we sign it or will it be expired vaccines? Now, the sad part is that I really don't think the health department will bring in expired vaccines into the country. They will make sure it's safe and effective. But because they don't communicate about it, people are completely confused, and there are stories going around about it. And how you handle a situation like this really is vital in how you're going to keep a nation calm, and that's not happening.
Mia, I want to stay with the issue of teachers, because what we're also seeing are infections, those cluster outbreaks that have been centralized to some schools. Just before we came to your interview, we had a clip of the EFF leader, Julius Malema, saying that he believes contact learning should be suspended until further notice, especially if the country is heading into the third wave. And yet we know the Education Department was planning on having schools, learners in primary school, back in school on a full-time basis by the end of next month. Does it mean that government might have to review some of these plans as the data changes?
I think there's conflicting data, Kathy. There's some data that shows us that it's okay to keep children in school, and then there's some data that shows us it's not okay. Part of the decision to give teachers vaccinations was to protect them when children start going back to school. But there's even evidence that shows us that teachers very, very rarely contract the infections from children in school, that they mostly contract it from outside. So the consensus around this issue is really not that clear. All we can hope for is that our vaccinations come into the country in time, the ones for the extra batch that we will get for teachers. But we can also just hope that not all our batches are contaminated. We don't know what the FDA is going to decide. The best thing we can hope for is for the FDA to make the announcement now.
All of this while we have an acting health minister in place, Mia?
Yes, and you probably want to know how will that impact our vaccination program. So in terms of the daily rollout in provinces, I don't think the absence of Zweli Mkhize will make a difference, because that's a provincial matter that has very little to do with our national health department. How will it impact decisions that we make around vaccines? The decision-making process in the National Health Department is quite complex, and they rely quite heavily on the Ministerial Advisory Committee. So I think because many people make decisions, it wouldn't impact impact a lot. I think where it would impact his absence is he was a very skilled negotiator for our Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson vaccines, and he could make good plans when there was a crisis. For instance, when the data came out that we couldn't use our AstraZeneca vaccines, he was the one who suggested that we try and get research Johnson & Johnson vaccines. And if we are going to negotiate for more vaccines, we have bought enough to use this year, but if there are any other processes where we would negotiate, we will miss someone with an institutionalized memory of how to deal with these complex pharmaceutical companies. The other situation where Willem Bhekisisa was always taken very seriously is by our COVID Command Council. He was very skillful and credible to them. He influenced their decisions very strongly, for instance, with regards to bans on alcohol sales during times when we needed hospital beds. And he was also skillful in selecting the correct scientists that could convince that council to make evidence-based decisions. And if we're not going to have someone who has a very good understanding of what has happened in COVID and the science around it, that will be difficult, but the compromise or the solution for that would, of course, be to rely very heavily on the Ministerial Advisory Committee and scientists in the country.
All right, Mia, let me thank you so much for your time, as always. A pleasure chatting to you. Bhekisisa, Editor-in-Chief there, Mia Malan.